Hello and welcome to another episode of Los Full Stackers with your hosts, Jose and Charlie.
Welcome, folks.
And today we are really excited to bring you this episode. In part, we have been planning for a while. It is an episode that hits home and also is more relevant than ever. And that is the topic of diversity and inclusion. And honestly, Charlie and I thought that there is no Los Full Stackers without this discussion. For Latinos like us, like living in the US, putting the topic on the table means realizing that there is a clear problem in the industry and we want to be part of that change. We honestly started this podcast as an idea to become a bridge that connects with English and Spanish speaking communities. Our commitment is to deliver content that is accessible, where any listener can jump in at any age, school level, mid-career, and we can meet you in a place where maybe we can build a space for you to learn and grow. And to do this and to bring this conversation to our podcast, we invited two amazing guests, which I'm really excited to have them on our show. We have Dr. Fiona Lee. Fiona is a PhD. She got her PhD in social psychology at Stanford University, where her research was on understanding the psychological barriers women face in professional settings. Currently, she is working at Pinterest, working as a people scientist. She just started a couple of weeks ago, and also she's working there to understand inclusion and diversity at Pinterest and make action plans for the company. But before joining Pinterest, that's how we actually met Fiona. She was working as a people scientist at Humo, that's where she met Charlie and I at the company, where she was doing similar work as a people scientist, and most of her work related to the driving and leading the work for the D&I product that nudges people towards inclusive behaviors at work. And also we have our other guest is Diana Lizarraga. Diana has been working on equity and inclusion since 1995. She has been working at UC Berkeley for 17 years, advocating for STEM communities. Some of her current research has been on technoInclusion, which we'll be hearing a lot later in the podcast. I'm really excited to hear this conversation of where it takes us, and is currently getting ready to launch at the end of the month a 200-page STEM guidebook called start.berkeley.edu. And currently, she's spending her shelter-in-place time with her family, also doing 3D printing of PPE face shields for community health clinics like Clínica Tepati. Welcome, Fiona and Diana. We're truly happy to have you in the show. Super excited to have you.
Thank you for having us.
Hello, thank you. That was an amazing introduction. Super happy to be here.
Thank you. And also, this is we're super excited to have you as our first guest of honor, and also first guest to coming to the show. And I think to kick off the conversation, first of all, I would like to ask. Maybe we can start with you, Fiona. I think and also we'll go with you, Diana, as well. The first thing that I wanted to ask you was, what is D&I? What is diversity and inclusion from the point of view of your profession, Fiona?
Well, that's a very big question to start. So D&I, it stands for diversity and inclusion. And so my profession is within private sector, and diversity and inclusion can be defined in many different ways across different industries and different companies. So I want to just kind of preface that what I share today will be something that represents what I've been working on, but I just want to acknowledge that there are many different ways of understanding and defining what D&I means. And I also believe that every single person should come up with their own definition of what D&I means to them. But from my experience so far, the way that diversity and inclusion is understood within private sector is diversity usually it refers to how literally how diverse the workforce is. So people who are making up that organization, how diverse those people are, diverse background those people are coming from. Different parts of that organization is representative of diverse thoughts and backgrounds, or cultural backgrounds or identities. Inclusion is more about the culture, so how inclusive the environment is for people to feel like they are valued and they have an opportunity to succeed at the organization, and whether they can really express themselves as they wish, and whether that environment is encouraging people to feel that way. So, and I really see that as two-part. So diversity is kind of more about the numeric representation of people, and who are in that meeting or who are in this organization. And inclusion is more about like what is the culture like, and whether those people in this group are feeling like they can speak up and be their best selves.
Great. And then for you, Diana, I know you've been doing a lot of work in academia. You were working at UC Berkeley for 17 years. And then from your perspective, what do you think is your perspective on this question in terms of from the academia perspective?
My take on diversity, equity, and inclusion is that it stands for excellence. When you're looking at diversity, you're looking at personal experiences, their values, their worldviews, their culture, their circumstances. And those can translate into language, religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, economic status, geographic region, a lot of different areas. So are we creating spaces for people to be successful, success zones, if you will? When I think about inclusion, we think about creating those environments where these folks can feel welcomed and respected and appreciated and valued, and also in the Berkeley context, challenged, right? We want you to feel appreciated, but also challenged, because we want your mind to grow as you're a student here or as you're doing research here. There is a researcher by the name of Lewin, and he looked at it as he was an educational psychologist, and he said behavior is a function of the person that you are and the environment that you're in. So that's a very important statement, because it's not the same thing if we give everybody a shoe, right? Everybody gets a shoe. Oh yeah, hey, that's, everybody is getting the same thing, but the shoe has to fit. So that's where kind of equity comes in. It's that guarantee of fair treatment and access and opportunity for everybody to advance. And so, trying to remove the barriers, that's what we work on, to prevent people from their full participation. We don't want that. So how do we remove those barriers? How do we create opportunity? And that's when I say, when we think about diversity and inclusion and equity, we're really thinking of standards of success and standards of excellence.
Nice. That's pretty cool. So, Diana, if you're okay, let's start the following question with you.
Sure.
So, we want to know, where did your D&I journey begin?
Sure. So for me, I was a waitress for 9 years. I ended up transferring as a community college student. But what I recognized is just, being a waitress is that I was treated differently, right? People didn't take me as seriously. And so I thought, I want to change my circumstances. I decided to work really hard, and I transferred as a reentry student. So my work with equity and inclusion began at community college when I worked for a program called Math, Engineering, and Science Achievement Program called MESA, and I was a student in that program. But what it helped me realize is that there were so many discrepancies in education. There was so much hidden curriculum that many of us who came from non-dominant backgrounds were facing, that without a little bit of support and guidance, it would be a really long journey. So I really appreciated their help, but it also helped me start to make light of STEM education, higher education inequities. And the reality was I wasn't seeing any professors that looked like me, so where were the role models that I could look up to? And even now, as I've worked to finish my doctorate, I think there's only 4% of Latinx folks that have doctorates, right? So the numbers are kind of small. So my work started there. When I transferred to UC Davis, one of the jobs that I helped put myself through school was I taught myself how to code. So this was in the late 90s. This is like 97 or so. And I was literally in a landscape of programmers where I really didn't see anybody that looked like me. So I was doing my code at night, building websites, helping put myself through school. But I also realized from that point on that my work with equity and inclusion kind of started there, because there was a lack of representation of women in coding. There was a lack of representation of imagery of what success looked like. So it started in the 90s, and I still am passionate about it today.
Wow, that's really inspiring. And let's jump this time with Fiona. Let me rephrase the question this time. When did the conversation start for you?
I'll kind of start from like my background. So like I actually grew up in South Korea, and I moved to the States when I started my college. And Korea is actually a very homogenous country. It only has one ethnic group, Koreans. We all speak the same language. So it's very not diverse country, and it's actually one of the least diverse country in the world. So growing up in Korea, and then I moved to the States. I had very different kind of upbringing, like not having experienced what it's like to witness or experience like racism. Although I would say like Korea has like some kind of patriarchal kind of culture. So as a woman, I would have experienced like those things. But I would say that in Korean culture, I wasn't really exposed to this idea of diversity and inclusion much. And then I came here and then I studied as an immigrant who had pretty severe language barrier to begin with. And I had my own experiences, but didn't really have like words to describe my experience. I always thought that, oh, English is not my first language. I'm not American. So like, I kind of thought that I don't belong here, and I'm not even feeling bad about it because I chose to come here. And then when I started my PhD, my lab, professors who were leading the lab did a lot of research on understanding stereotype threat, like threats that people experience when they know that there are stereotypes targeting their social group, and how that can harm academic achievement of students, or how that can prevent a woman from succeeding. So I got exposed to a lot of ideas of like stereotypes and prejudice, this type of dynamics, that interpersonal dynamics that happen when there are multiple social groups. And then it was like not even termed as D&I, but then all like these very psychological processes that are real in our day-to-day experiences. And then I resonated with those examples of stereotypes or prejudice or discrimination, what it feels like to be in a situation where I have this pressure that makes me feel nervous and not being able to be my best self. And that really gave me the language that I can use to explain my experience. And I just knew 100% that this is real and this is really affecting people's experience. And if there's any way to help lifting that, like literally like barrier that's preventing people to be their best self, like that will be really meaningful. So I wanted to really understand the process, like psychological process of how these stereotyping or discrimination affects the target of discrimination, and what can we do to make sure everyone really thrive and tap into their potential. What can the individuals do, or what can organizations or bigger social institutions can do? So that was like where I kind of started becoming really interested in this line of research. And I started working on dissertation that I can talk about later at length on what kind of psychological barriers that women face and how can that be addressed. But that's kind of how it began. And as I started working in industry after finishing my PhD, I learned that DNI is like a term that kind of talks about many things, like all of these psychological processes. So that I heard, like I kind of have to do like a work to like relearn like the language that are used in the in like a more industry setting.
Yeah, and I wanted to like bring another point here. I think I like when you were mentioning that you felt there was like a responsibility, not just from the like people experiencing some kind of like like a flavor of diversity and inclusion, but also like people who are like kind of like acting as well, kind of like people who are affecting people's lives. So I think a next topic that I wanted to bring as well and here in this conversation was like the responsibility. I think I feel that there is a responsibility from people that might feel that either like they're trying to like like join some kind of a community, or you're a member of a community. Either you're acting as a member. There's also like other members who eventually you become friends, and this could be different places. This could be in academia where you are surrounded by professors, you're surrounded by like students, deans, and then in the workplace we have managers, directors, CEOs. So maybe we could start with you, Diana. And I think I wanted to ask, like we have this different persona, different people who work in these communities. And my question for this would be, what do we think is the responsibility of these personas in these communities to create these spaces where diversity and inclusion could thrive. We could have places where people could feel like they could be the true selves in those places.
I think for me, the way that I would approach it, and again, this is my own personal opinion, is that responsibility doesn't land just on one department or one division or one person, right? You need to create that positive campus climate, that welcoming space. And some of that work is done through validating students, right? They need to feel that sense of belonging. They need to feel welcome to a campus. And there's a lot of different ways, just like there's microaggressions, there's also micro contributions that folks can do and become those validating agents to let students know, wow, you did really great on this paper, or we've got a lot of office hours for everybody. Want to encourage anybody who feels like they want to have a conversation about physics or whatnot to come and join the conversation. So it's also about creating those welcoming attitudes and using the language that's inclusive, but also understanding that there's so many differences, right? Students are made up of so many different attributes, so many different backgrounds. How do you think about being inclusive to everybody? Sometimes that's overwhelming for a staff person or for faculty. So how do you get started? And so it's important that they have access to training so they can get information about this and digest it as they, are able to, but also that there's a vision for E&I success on campus. And what does that look like? Creating that vision for your department, having those conversations in your research labs, right? So it also kind of starts with communication. What does that look like in your space? And we have at Berkeley tools and techniques that we use to help create more inclusive spaces, not only just for students, but for faculty and for employees and alumni.
Nice. And how about you, Fiona? What are your thoughts? Like similar question, but in the workplace.
Yeah, they are in the workplace. I'm just going to talk about organizations in general. And I can think of different players like the leadership, who is usually in charge of setting the company value and also creating procedures and processes for promotion or hiring and like many things that really shape the operation of the company. And I could think of more of like senior leaders or like managers who lead the team and who kind of have like more of day-to-day interactions with the team members or like the employees, who also create like the norms and culture within their team. And then there are employees or who are coworkers to each other, and they engage in daily interactions with each other and that becomes like the reality of each individual, and like they will also contribute to the creation of the culture. So like talking about like these like three players, I would say that they all have their role in creating a bit more diverse and inclusive environment at the organization. And just to start with the leaders, I can think of a couple. I mean, leaders take the most greatest, very big responsibility in building more diverse and inclusive company, because first of all, they can kind of set the hiring practices and procedure, which is like the beginning of everything. Like, yeah, it all starts with having some diversity. Like if there's no diversity there, then even if everyone feels like they belong, that's not like diverse and inclusive environment. So it's important for the leaders to set like very specific diversity goal, like how they envision their company to look like. Like starting from very beginning of the of starting the business and coming up with a long-term vision, and set the strategy and keep communicating that to the rest of the members of the community. And also it's the leaders play a really important role in creating a value that really highlights the importance of diversity and inclusion. And they have this responsibility of keep communicating to that to the rest of the employees, so that they signal that it's really important to exhibit like inclusive behaviors in every level, so that inclusive practices and behaviors are rewarded. And when there is any violation of or any form of harassment or discrimination, people know that there will be a consequence for that, and the company takes a very strong stance on it. And also they are responsible for setting the right and fair and transparent procedures, because they can't control like every single employee's attitude towards diversity and inclusion. But what they can do is to set procedures that will guide their behaviors, that will reward certain behaviors and penalize like some behaviors that are harmful. So they can make the promotion processes or advancement processes or evaluation processes more fair by making sure it is helping people make decisions that are more objective and that are not tainted by like the implicit biases they might have. So that could be like what leaders can play a role. And for managers who are leading a team, their role is also really important, because employees spend the most time like within their team, and the culture they perceive through their team shapes their perception of the organization, and they will kind of project their experience with their managers to their perception of the leadership or the bigger company. So the managers are responsible for creating a norm and culture within their team that is inclusive. So making sure when they make a decision, they hear from people on their team and give their consideration of all the views that they can get, or actively seek for feedback, not just for people that they are close to, like the report they're close to, but to everyone that they are managing, and try to be mindful of like whom they're building the relationship with, and also amplifying voices and kind of sponsor people who might be coming from like underrepresented background, because they might lack that kind of social resources. And for individual employees, and it's easy for them to think that building inclusive culture is a job of the leadership and like a D&I team, but in fact, their behaviors create the reality of their coworkers. So it's important for them to be aware of like what they can do.
And if I can add to Fiona's comments, when we're talking about looking at organizational culture, whether it's the team lead or the vice president, you really need to understand your particular group's currency. If you're in a research setting, it might be your lab currency. What does that look like? And you really need to have conversation. And these sometimes are healthy, what we call healthy conversations about some of the things that you're seeing. And you need to be able to ask, when we talk about responsibility, there are ways for staff to ask questions. Does the company have, or does the department have a strategic plan for equity and inclusion? Is that part of their mission, their vision? What are the core values? And has your company had an employee climate survey? And if so, what are the results, right? Often that can be very helpful in understanding how you might prepare to embrace change if it's needed. And you need to have those self-assessments to gather that type of information so that you can really make the best decision for your community of employees, expanding the capability of not just your team, but the organization, and providing those pathways to think about promoting success of your workforce. And again, preparing in some cases to embrace the change that may need to happen.
For sure. And for individuals, it's really important for them to believe that the change is possible. And when there is an opportunity to share their feedback, share their experience, so that they can inform the decision made by the leadership. And one thing that I want to talk about, or what individuals can do or they're responsible for, is to constantly learn from others and be open to different ideas or different perspectives, opinions coming from someone who are very different from them. Like immediate reaction when you are talking to someone who are very different from you, like you might immediately just feel like less open, because it's just different and I'm not used to it. I don't find it comfortable. And an immediate reaction can be kind of rejected or be more defensive, not be interested. But it's really about opening yourself to multiple views and constantly learn from perspectives that might be different from yours.
It's really cool to hear that there are benefits from diversity and inclusion in the workplace and in academia. But there's a concern that we hear very often from folks in the IT industry and also from our listeners, and it is about the impact of diversity and inclusion in products. For example, while developing a product, there are some people that think that diversity and inclusion is just a marketing trend to gain attraction and potential coworkers or employees. Um, and we want to know if there is actually any real impact in the development of a product if we treat diversity and inclusion as a first-class citizen.
Yeah, sure. And I would say like 100%. And also that's actually like the reason that companies or any organization should invest in diversity and inclusion is, I mean, there are many, many reasons because it's like the right thing to do. And it is to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to tap into their potential. But it's not just like a nice thing to have, but it is like a critical to the success of the organization. And there's many research that shows how a more diverse team or a more diverse organization is also more innovative, and they are better at coming up with more creative solutions. And if you really think about what diversity and inclusion means, it's pretty obvious, because that if you have a team of people that have many more different types of life experiences or skill sets or perspectives, then you start with a greater and broader pool of ideas to begin with. And if you think about like product development, you can now we are like all the products are serving very global and very, very broad user base. People have with like many different needs and very many different kind of experiences, and having just a homogenous group of people who are building the product can't capture all of those ideas. And if there's more diverse group of people who are involved in that decision making or designing of that product, then that will make sure that there are perspective that's closer to a potential user and who will know what it's like to be using this product, and making sure the product addresses those like variety of needs. And that's kind of like how diversity can help building a better product and addressing the needs of like more variety of users. But it's also important to have more inclusive culture within that group, because even if there are a variety of ideas present in that group, if people feel like different ideas or disagreements are not welcomed, then they are not going to share that idea. So even if there are people in the room, you're not going to get those ideas from people because they're not going to be willing to share. So it's important to have both the diversity within the group and inclusive culture or processes in facilitating the discussions or making decisions.
Okay, so we can say that the benefits of diversity and inclusion goes way beyond the workplace. At the end, it becomes part of the quality of a product and goes directly to the users.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And if I could just add, for that particular thought process, part of that, having that diverse workforce that promotes creativity, is making sure that the students that are going to school are diverse and they're well supported. And, like, for example, first generation students, helping make sure that they can navigate and go through and be successful. You're more likely to be a first generation student as a transfer student than you are as an incoming freshman. So how do we celebrate and help and support transfer students so that they can get through, get their degree, enter the workforce? And having more voices at the table is going to lead to innovation, and that really does increase economic opportunity. And I think we can see that here in California, right? I think we're the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. So we really do want to promote those opportunities for cross-pollination among ideas, but also, like Fiona said, we want to make sure that when folks are sharing their ideas, that it's well received and respected in the way that it's communicated and received.
Great. Yeah, and I think the next thing that I wanted to mention, we have talked about, like the product. We have talked about like the definition and the different there's different layers of DNI. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was sort of like the different terms, and I feel like these are terms that at one point some of us may have encountered them. Maybe we have heard them perhaps in the news or perhaps an article, or like a friend maybe brought this term. So I wanted to go over a couple of terms, like with you, Diana. If you want to talk about these terms, and
Sure.
also like talk about like different like strategies or different ways that people could like navigate navigate this like different different terms. And the first one that I wanted to start with, it was actually one that a friend in a way made me aware of this, and he referred to this idea of a cultural tax. And then I asked him, what do you mean by a cultural tax? And he was telling me about this idea that there is like sometimes when you come from when you based on your background, based if you speak another language or you have some sort of like a cultural heritage, there tends to be like sort of a like an implicit or explicit expectation, and like people expect you to know, kind of like be like an ambassador. Like he was, I mean, people have some sort of expectation on you to know something just because you happen to be, I don't know, from a certain neighborhood, you happen to be from a certain city, or you happen to speak certain languages. People expect you to be some sort of an ambassador, but then we were like, like this is something that we don't see that it happens to everyone. It just happens to certain people who have like some sort of like heritage on them. Which it takes me to another like research that I had read about that. There was like this idea about Tenglis tasks, and was also like this research that said that occasionally there is like occasions where at the workplace, women, for example, there were occasions where they had their daily jobs and their daily tasks that they had to do, but sometimes they would do things because they felt pressure to do them, or they felt that they were like kind of like expected to do it. And like one example, it was like doing service tasks. This could be, for example, organizing a meeting, or like kind of like rallying everyone in the company to do some kind of event or something, even though it was not expecting them. So that was more of a something that there was kind of like was pressure on them to do. So given this, and also like this kind of like small kind of like backstory on this, I wanted to hear maybe for you, Fiona, we could talk about this in terms of like when individuals encounter this like situation, like what do you think could be like strategies or like ways that this situation could be navigated, like based on your like your research?
Yeah, so about the culture text, I think it's like a tricky situation to be in because like you don't want to like shut off the conversation. And I think like for me, like personally, like I when like my non-Korean friend asks me about like Korean cuisine or Korean town, like I'm like happy to share. But then like the problem begins like when it becomes excessive. But that means that you don't want to always, like not share. Like there might be times that you are willing to and like you're excited to like tell your friends about like your heritage or cultural background, but like it's becomes not sustainable if you become the only person who will share this knowledge. um, so I think so eventually I think there is especially in the context of organization, there's a lot that others can do, like because it's the burden on that individual and it's too much of an ask to tell that person to navigate it yourself, although they need like a real help. So I think eventually it's like leaders or allies or others are responsible for being more aware of like what kind of questions they ask, and doing the homework yourself and doing research yourself, and then reach out for additional like help or information when it's like really necessary, and for leaders or kind of policymakers to make more of like a standardized kind of platform or programs that can facilitate that type of education, and lift that burden from those individuals, like make it like a part of the organizational process. Mm-hmm. So I think that like eventually it's like really up to the leaders and individuals or people who are reaching out to these individuals to do. But like for individuals, like when they find themselves in the situation like that, I'm not sure if this is like a really good solution, but I think it's good to share, not just like if you just like give like one answer to that question, then it becomes like they'll like keep coming back to you for finding more information. But I think it'll be nice to kind of point them to the right resources where they can really have like a deeper learning. So instead of just like giving like just like a very short and like immediate answer to that particular question, maybe you can kind of challenge them and like, oh, like you want to learn more about it? Like, why don't you check out this book about like more general, like more comprehensive, I don't know, like information about culture, or you can kind of like motivate them to kind of explore themselves or kind of ask them back and, oh, like what kind of like research have you tried and what did you find most interesting? And then if they actually say that, oh, I actually haven't really found anything, like, read anything else, and you can kind of remind them that there are a lot of resources out there. I think that can be like one good way to kind of teach them how they can learn themselves, like before reaching out to these individuals who have like that kind of cultural background. So that's like one thing that I can think of. I'm curious to hear from Deanna what she thinks.
Sure. So for me, there's a couple different ways that I kind of interpret it when it happens to me. And sometimes I think people are giving some dialogue with me and they intend it as a pebble, right? But how it lands on me is like a boulder. And sometimes what I might say back might land as a boulder when I intend it as a pebble. So these kinds of ways in which signaling and communication are amplified are important. But I also respect the fact that sometimes it's okay to respond as you feel comfortable, right? So I really have to say that their curiosity does not translate into someone's obligation to educate them if they don't feel comfortable. So sometimes you have to give yourself permission to step back if you need to. And, it's okay to just excuse yourself from that situation if you don't feel comfortable answering. But sometimes you're presented in a situation and you feel like, wow, if I don't respond, that might be kind of awkward as well. And so, people have come to me, asked me a lot of questions over the years, and sometimes I will just simply take a pause, have a moment to process what they asked me, and then I will simply repeat the question slowly back to them, and then I'll take another pause. And often that is enough for the person to take a moment and say, oh, wow, maybe I should have asked it in another way, or maybe my real question is this. I hope I didn't offend you. Often, when we talk about those types of things, they can be unintentional. But sometimes they do communicate hostile or negative messages, right, to a marginalized group or a marginalized person. And so we have to be careful about that.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like, kind of like the previous one that we had said in the podcast, it is difficult sometimes to kind of like speak back, to not speak, but kind of like not like talking back, but kind of like replying in a way that, like you say, like, I could answer the question, but let me tell you, like, like maybe I don't feel comfortable answering the question, but I think it goes like back to what we said earlier, like building those like safe environments, like building places like where people feel like comfortable, like being able to like being able to like say back like kind of like a response that they feel like kind of like saying like I don't feel like comfortable saying this, but feeling comfortable also saying that in a place in an environment in a community where they feel comfortable saying that as well.
And sometimes it's okay to also just add in there, that's such an interesting question. When a student, doesn't want to put themselves on the spot, they don't have to make a commitment to whether it's a good question or a bad question. They can just say simply a very neutral word. It's very interesting. That's such an interesting question. Let me take some time to process what you're telling me. And, you don't have to commit to an answer.
Yeah, I like that. And the next one is like, this, I think it reminds me, like, it is similar, but maybe I think there's like another one that we also have heard as well is, which I think is a bit of an overlap with this next one is like the word microaggressions that is at least my interpretation is it is something that you're told. Maybe the intent is not like kind of like bad, like they don't intend it to be in a negative way, but the user, the person who says that they don't intend it like that, but the person who gets the question in the other end, this could be something that is kind of like perceived like, hey, like this is not, I don't feel comfortable answering this, like maybe this is not like the right thing to be asking me. One example that I heard like tied to this is like one example, like if you like your hair, for example, like people like start touching your hair and be like, hey, you have nice hair, and then they start people just go directly touching your hair, and then you're like, wait, why are you what are you doing? And then for some people it could be that this is, I don't see that as a offensive, but the person in the other end, in the receiving end, is like they feel, like, hey, like this is my space, this is like, I did not intend it to be for you to be just be you was grabbing my hair just like that. So it's like from your perspective, what are ways for like also like similar? Do you feel is this similar to the previous term, or do you feel it's a little different from the previous term that we said? Maybe in this case, Fiona, if you want to tackle this one.
Yeah. So I kind of, like you mentioned, I think this is kind of similar in a sense that like the community member is like responsible for educating themselves, and if you exhibit like microaggression when you don't intend to, that means that you are lacking awareness or knowledge, and once you become aware of like how your unintentional remark can be perceived as an aggression and how that can signal your implicit prejudice, then you need that awareness to correct your own behavior. So it's like really onto people who are exerting these microaggressions. But then given that, if being a target of the microaggression, I think most important thing is to find a way that you feel comfortable addressing it. So like if you are someone who is okay pointing out the behavior and kind of pausing the person and like, hey, like what you just said, I know that you didn't mean it this way, but it actually made me feel this way, and I would like you to know that. So like if you feel comfortable pointing that out and express how that remark made you feel, I think that's like what you can do. But then if you don't feel like, it's possible that like someone might not feel comfortable pointing out the person, and then I think instead of pushing yourself to confronting it, I think there's some value in exploring what other ways am I comfortable coping this situation with. So for example, I kind of like using humor, and instead of saying that, oh, like that was not nice, or like doing that, I kind of like try to make it like lighthearted. I don't know if it's the best strategy, but that works for me, and it helps me engage with the situation more instead of doing nothing. So I do believe that it's like better than not doing anything. So I use humor to kind of lighten up the situation, and so that like the person will be open to what I'm going to share. And it actually makes me feel a little more comfortable talking about my experience of being hurt by the remark. So that's like one example of like how you can find a way that works for you.
Yeah. And then maybe, and for this last one, so maybe Diana, you could give us maybe the perspective on this one. I heard another term that I think I heard it before as well. There's this idea of privilege, and I think this one, it's a little interesting. I think in the sense that I feel like to some extent, like we might not be able to, some might not be aware of like what this is. So maybe there is like this, like some people think, like like what is this? Like I don't feel like there's like a privilege. I think for me things might seem like normal, but there's like other people that might make you aware, like no, like some people might have like an advantage over others, but I think, and from you, I think I would like to maybe hear the perspective on maybe an academy, maybe from the different students that you have that you have met across the years. And maybe an interesting question could be, like, what do you think as being like in terms of like the word, like how you feel like maybe students have been impacted by this word, or maybe how people they navigated this, like, or like how they navigate when they encounter this term in their lifetime.
Well, let me share a story. So, and it's related to microaggression, related, I guess, to privilege. Is when we think about microaggression, the subtle slights or the indignities based on a marginalized group, which could be like race or gender or sexual orientation, that over time, right? There's only so much someone can take, but when a microaggression happens, it does impact us. It can impact a student's achievement, their well-being, their motivation. And I'm sure that's also true for staff. So here's the story. I was with a group of students, and this is when I was a student, and I was going, and this was actually a couple years ago, I was going to a workshop to learn more about this one particular code I was learning in geographic information systems with ArcGIS. And I was going into this older building, and this was an agriculture related building. And as I was going through to get to that particular coding workshop to learn, I saw on the walls these pictures of older, I'll just say dominant, they looked Caucasian, men that were on the wall. And the men looked like they were probably in their 60s or so. And the wall was just full of it. So before I even got to the space where I was going to learn, there was already kind of this definition on the wall of what success looked like. So it was kind of this nonverbal environmental piece that I was reacting to. And so the other folks, they didn't even realize that that was an issue for me, right? So sometimes folks don't necessarily think about what it means to be from a dominant community in that dominant society. We have to think about the benefits that have been given to them, the advantages. And so as I sort of looked at that, I had to say to myself, well, what am I going to do about it? Now I'm older, right? As an undergrad, I don't know that I would have had the courage, emotional courage, or the time to have stepped back, processed that, and done anything. And so what I decided to do is take a series of pictures of those images, and I sent a message to the dean of that department, of that building, and said, I'm sure it's unintentional, but I wanted to share that here's what I experienced, and here are some of the images. And I was pleasantly surprised that they actually called me to a meeting. And when I got to that meeting, who I thought would be with just maybe 1 or 2 people, it was like with 7 people on campus, from facilities to, the building coordinator, all these different people. And they were very interested in hearing my concern. And I shared the pictures. They understood how that made me feel as a person of color. And they made a commitment to try to find a way to add more diversity, equity, and inclusion to that space. And so when we think about privilege, how do we show up in spaces? It is a privilege to have the opportunity to just talk here right now on this podcast. I come to this podcast, with the training and the work that I've done in the School of Education, and the thoughtfulness of how my teachers have worked with me, and how equity and inclusion at Berkeley has helped shape my thoughts as I develop, into this person who's going to be getting a doctorate. But that's a privilege, right? So people have privilege in different ways. How do you show up to that space? And it's up to a lot of us to stand up for our communities and make sure that we're creating those inclusive environments so that people can feel welcomed. So that's just one example. And there's actually some really interesting research that's done out of UC Santa Cruz on microaggression. They actually had built a microaggression app where students, if they experienced something on campus, they could make note of that in this app, and it would map out those spaces. So now we're using technology to really think about how can we create spaces that are more inclusive and have data behind it to back it, and understand what's going on with those microaggressions. So I think that is changing in some small ways, and I think that's really interesting to see how that will play out. But in terms of thinking about privilege, there's it's a construct, right? Privilege is it can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. So I think you have to take a moment and think about, how are we privileged? Do we have our basics needs met? Do we have a house? Do we have food security? Some spaces on campus don't necessarily have that, and we have to make sure that we're thinking through on how we can support multiple communities.
Something I also want to add to the conversation on privilege is, I think there's an inherent kind of barrier in noticing one's own privilege, because privilege is not noticing what kind of privilege you have, because you didn't even have to think about it. You only and then you don't have the experience of the ones who are underprivileged, so you don't even know what that is. So you don't know what kind of inconvenience or discomfort or anxiety like one might experience, because you don't have the reference point. So I really feel like for you to become aware of the privilege that you have, it really requires constant learning of the privileges and the experience of the ones who might not have the same type of privilege that you have. So it's something that requires like a lifelong learning, and yeah, it requires some efforts.
Yeah, there was a researcher, like McIntosh, but she had written about, and that's sort of like the first time that I kind of, as I read her research, was like, wow, that was a big change that she did with her work, unpacking the invisible knapsack. So a lot of what when people talk about white privilege, a lot of focus is brought back to that research by McIntosh, who kind of mapped that out and kind of made that part of the diversity discussion, where that maybe wasn't in the same space before. So I think that's also really important, is that there are researchers out there that are doing this, and those are things that people can, if they're interested, learn more about.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's great. And it has been really interesting to understand better what is D&I and what is important to open the conversation. But let's talk about actions. We know that you have been working on some research and initiatives to confront the situation. Let's start with you, Diana. We know that you are currently finding and recruiting undergrad students to pursue STEM careers. And at the same time, you are driving ideas on the theory of technoinclusion, where you are working on building digital spaces with a lens of equity and inclusion. And we want to know, how did the theory start? And also, what are some examples where these spaces are driving change?
Sure. So I started thinking about techno-inclusion a while back. So must have been around 2009 or so. I got the call from my doctor saying, hey, you're going to have to start chemotherapy. And I was really taken back by that, because I was like, oh no, no one wants to do that. I was also really concerned that I was going to lose touch with my students. And so I started really thinking through how I was going to be able to connect with them without commuting from Davis to Berkeley, because I would be too ill to go on the train or to commute. And so I started texting my students, and I started Skyping with them. And that, I thought, I don't know if they'll embrace that, but they really did. And so what I started doing, these just sort of micro touches with them, checking in with them. And what I realized is that that experience was actually very meaningful to them, but also it was something that it was their way of communicating. These students were technologically amplified students in a way that other generations of students weren't. So they were super hyper connected, and they were what I call extreme learners. We're seeing students now that are triple majors. So they're not just like math or physics, they're math, physics, data science. So triple majors. So working with this generation of students and trying to find practices with equity and inclusion that I could share with them, I started thinking about, okay, I could start sending out positive text messages and kind of validating the things that they were doing, like great job on your research poster or things like that. Or when I found a great article, or when like Macy Jameson was coming to the Bay Area to give a talk, I could say, oh, hey, this is you in 10 years, so just positive ways of kind of creating a positive campus climate and validating their STEM trajectory where they wanted to go. But what I found is when I started my doctorate, I couldn't find a term for that, right? A way of kind of validating and creating a sense of belonging using technology and equity and inclusion. And so I kept looking, and I found three theories that I really liked in the areas of positive organizational culture, or we would call that maybe campus climate at a university, sense of belonging, and validation. And so when I couldn't find anything, I finally decided, well, I'm just going to kind of create my own theory. You don't set off to the doctorate to go, I'm going to create my own theory, but that's just sort of the journey that I went on, was creating this theory so that I could have a way to use equity and inclusion through technology to either have a sense of belonging or a positive organizational culture or validation to students, or, if you were in a company, you could call it employees, that connect them to activities, information, opportunities, and networks, because that's really important. So as I've evolved that, so I finally came to a place where I felt really good about that theory in about 2018. And then I kind of polished it up in 2019. So now that I have this theory, how do I use it, right? Because it involves digital spaces, equity and inclusion, and human behavior. And so I started building this giant website, which I'm getting ready to launch in a couple weeks, and it's called star.berkeley.edu. So when you think about like what are some examples of techno inclusion, there are a lot of things that people are already doing just in everyday life that are very techno inclusive, and they might not realize it, but now there's a word. So for me, for this website, I decided I'm going to make some STEM profiles of students from a lot of different backgrounds. And a lot of these different backgrounds, hopefully when students have access to this and can start looking at it, they can start realizing, wow, if they can do it, I can do it. So how do we kind of create those similarities, those differences? How do we think about that in a way that will help us connect students in a positive manner? So another way might be techno inclusion when you put in, for example, if you're using Zoom and instead of saying just your name, Diana, you might say Diana, she, her, ella, right? So you might use your pronouns. That's another way of using techno inclusion. Something else with techno inclusion that we did was when graduation celebrations were canceled, that was really, really hard because so many students didn't get that experience. And so we had an online virtual graduation celebration, and we had Cal's mariachi band play, and that was very meaningful to students. So creating those ways of connecting them to opportunities and networks, really important. Another thing that might be techno inclusive, if let's talk about emojis, right? So emojis have been around for a while, but every year they launch new emojis. And what we're finding is that there's more inclusive emojis that are being shown so that more identities can be represented. When emojis first came out, there wasn't necessarily emojis using a wheelchair, for example. And now that is one that we have, and that wasn't there before. If a student is texting me and they are like, oh, can you please write me a letter of rec? And they have like brown hands praying. And I respond to them with a brown thumb saying, absolutely, we'd be happy to do that. That's a way of us checking each other in a way. We recognize and appreciate that other person's identity. So techno inclusion can be a lot of different things, but that creating a digital database that has really important, not just the categories for the search terms, but the tags are inclusive. And I'm really excited about star.berkeley.edu because in phase 2 of that, we're launching a lot. We used grounded theory to go through about 300 search terms and organize them into themes so that we could create categories and really good tags. So that's another example of techno inclusion.
I really like the example of the emoji, and I even kind of think of it as like a micro inclusion because it kind of signals like what is, if you don't have like that option, then you will take it as like a signal of like what is standard, what is normal, who belongs to this digital environment. But then having more representation of skin color or people who might be living with disability, I think that signals to those people that like they belong and they are part of this digital community.
And I think we all want that, right? So it's not just looking at the in-person physicalness of a company. It's also looking at those digital spaces. How is a campus being inclusive to students, right? We were especially supposed to launch this website in January 2021, but I really felt like I could cut all of the steps in half and do a phase 1, phase 2, because I really wanted to provide students with opportunity and hope that they will feel valued by all these different programs and resources and communities that are just waiting to meet them. So I think, there's different ways we can connect, but being intentional, I think that's the key word, intentional about making those digital spaces welcoming for all. And that also, to the photos that you use, to the way that your search engine works, the words that you're using. So it's been a great project. I love the research, and I'm excited that this is, moving forward, and I'm hoping to finish my doctorate in a few months, but it's been the journey.
I have a following question about the skin color for the emojis. I think a couple of years ago we only had the yellow skin colors and sometimes the green color.
Exactly.
And I think there might be people that can say, let's keep it simple. Let's go back to just have the yellow skin color and stop the debate. Do you think that the skin color actually makes a difference, or it is just nice to have for diversity and inclusion?
Well, I think it allows you, right, to express the person that you are, right? We're not all Lego yellow. We're not all Lego yellow. And the form of using images, right, with words and whatnot, that's something that's centuries old, right? Rebus, they used to use images to share stories. You know, gosh, that's really a really old technique. So really, we're just reinventing that in the Emojicon to express ourselves more fully and to express our words in symbols. And that is something that we can now do. You know, I can ask students, hey, what are you doing? And they can just, you know, send me back a thumbs up or send me back, hey, you know, a sunset or something like that. And we kind of get a vibe of what's going on. So it's this whole nother world of connecting with students. And remember, students, they're technologically amplified in a way that we, at least my generation, never was. So they, on average, I think it's receive and give, or I'd say text out over 3,800 text messages a month. So it makes sense for us to communicate in a way that is their primary source of communication digitally, which is via text. So I think it's important that we lean into that and that we embrace it and that we listen to what others are saying. There's actually a group that puts out emojis, and so they have these discussions about different kinds of emojis that are cut. There's now the sloth emoji. There's all these other, you know, changes and emojis that are happening, but it's very hard to keep track of all of them all the time, but they are more inclusive. The colors make a difference. The age makes a difference, right? Not everybody is a young emoji, right? So my mom, you know, she's like, oh, look, there's a grandma emoji. And I thought, wow, she calls out the grandma emoji. So I find it fascinating, you know, that people can now express themselves. And I think they appreciate that.
Awesome. And in your case, Fiona, while in grad school, you did your dissertation on how women feel a greater need to be prepared before applying for a job than men do. And also, you present different ways companies can help to close such gender gaps. We want to know, how was your experience researching this field?
Yeah. So, and one thing I also want to say is that this doesn't apply only to women, but like whoever who might experience a stereotype threat, or who might be coming from, who don't see as many people like themselves in that community, like like a workplace or a school, they might doubt themselves, or they might feel like they have to do more to prove themselves, or have more qualifications to be eligible for that position, for example. So like this is, I looked at what I looked into women, but I would want to say that like it doesn't only is constrained within women's experience. But just to talk more about my research, so I started working on this idea after reading an article titled "The Confidence Gap," which was published in the Atlantic. And they were talking about like how there's this confidence gap in women, and like they lack confidence and in the professional setting. And they include this quote that said how women apply for a job when they feel like they are 100% ready and they have like have 100% of the qualifications listed on the job description, while men do that when men are willing to apply when they meet only 60% of the qualification. And I was intrigued by that statement, and I looked up like what's the source, and it was actually cited by Lin In, the book by Sheryl Sandberg. It's cited in like many places, but actually it was not really based on like a real research, or it's claimed to be based on internal research, but I could not find the source. And I actually read about a lot of other people who tried to find the source, but who couldn't. So I realized that this is actually based on anecdotes, which is, I'm not like saying that that's like not true. Like I think it's fair that people might have seen this in many occasions and they think that this is like a phenomena. But I just wanted to kind of test it and see if this is actually the case, to support that with some empirical evidence. So I actually ran this research primarily on like online survey studies, asking people about like how much percentage of job qualifications would you like to have before or when you apply for a new job. And I consistently found that it was like not as big difference, like 100% versus 60%, but I still saw a statistically significant differences in the percentage of work qualification one wants to have between men and women. So I manipulated the job description to convey different set of values. And what I found was that when the job description mentioned how the company values learning on the job, and they have like resources for learning, that actually closed that gap, because now women were more willing to apply for that position without having as, high qualifications. So that like lowered that expectation to be prepared amongst women, and that closed the gender gap. So this kind of suggests that there's something that companies, like organizations, can do. So like by explicitly communicate what their expectations are, and also importantly, communicating that they value learning, and they understands that like learning is necessary, and like there will be some things that people will have to learn on the job, and they understand that, and they will support that. And by communicating this, that makes sure that everyone is on the same page and have the same expectation for the job, and that will encourage them to take this opportunity equally without putting women under greater burden to be more overly prepared. So that was kind of like the second point. And although I didn't run this study in like the real field setting, this just like suggests like how there are many ways that companies can communicate their values and set like the same expectations on their like job applicants. And I know that there are companies like Textio, like they are consulting kind of company that reviews the job description of the company and evaluates whether this is biased, whether this is going to be perceived as like more competitive by women. So there are some kind of technological solutions, like kind of to Diana's point, technological solutions that can help reduce the kind of biases. I think the companies are more and more likely to find themselves in a situation where they learn that some of their procedures are biased in a way they don't want to be, and then they like have to learn how to fix that and like remove those biases. And like one example is like a lot of companies kind of have self-promotion kind of policy, so like a self-nomination policy for promotion, but that might actually attract fewer female highly qualified and high performing individuals from nominating themselves, because women are less likely to promote themselves than men. I heard that like at Google, like they actually found data that women were much less likely to nominate themselves, and then after they learned that, they sent like an email reminder to everyone before the promotion season that there is this finding. And like we see this pattern, or there's research that also shows that women are less likely to promote themselves even when they're equally qualifying. And so like, and just sharing that as a reminder, and that was enough for people to be aware of that bias, and then that actually led to more self-nomination by women, and that closed that gap or difference in the candidates in the promotion pool and the actual result of the promotion. So I would say that like companies are becoming aware of these type of implicit like biases that are present in policies, and they're making some efforts to remove them from their practices.
That's so interesting, because there's something called Stereotype Threat. And Stereotype Threat it was out of Stanford. Was it Claude Steele? I think that was his theory. Where if you were to tell a group of non-dominant students, typically students from this background do worse on this test, that they'll actually do worse. But when I hear the converse is sort of like, hey, women don't necessarily apply, and then that kind of changed things and motivated them to go. That's so fascinating. And it's great to hear that more women are, because I think we have to tell ourselves as women, when people say, oh, you worked really great job, you did really good job, instead of us discounting that like, oh, it was nothing, we need to be able to say, thank you for recognizing our hard work, right? So change that language to lean. in many ways.
I think it's because like for self-promotion, being humble and not to brag is kind of like it's like a virtuous thing for women. Like it's like a very gendered virtue. And for a woman to kind of really speak out about their own accomplishments might feel first uncomfortable because of these like societal expectation. And in fact, it is like more penalized because of that. So like they are aware of maybe a woman might have experience of getting the pushback when they did that. So I think there are many reasons why women would choose not to nominate themselves. But then when they hear this type of communication from the company, they now trust the company. They're like, oh, like they are encouraging women to be more vocal about their accomplishments. And it also kind of gives them some kind of extra context that can also just push them forward on action that they wouldn't have taken otherwise.
No, I think like I also want to like I think we have one thing that I've noted. I think DNI. I think one thing that I wanted to mention is that I feel like DNI is like one of those conversations that I feel that it doesn't end like in 1 hour, like in 2 hours. I think it's honestly a conversation that has many dimensions. And I think one thing that I'm fascinated by both of your research, is that when we think of diversity inclusion, there people might think of just like could be just like race or like ethnicity, but I think there's many dimensions to this conversation. There's many dimensions where inclusion could also mean through technology. In the case of Diana, I think that was really amazing what you mentioned about having inclusion even by something as little as the emojis, like the color, like by seeing that, like that variety, by seeing like, hey, like that I am being represented there. I'm being represented by that emoji that has like the color of my skin or something that is similar to that represents my age. I think it's fascinating to see that this conversation is not just about including just like something about colors, also including like inclusion could mean different. It could mean different thing. Like could mean like making just things accessible for someone. Making things accessible to someone that
Policies.
might not. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even digitally, as students are doing remote learning, right? There may be children that have autism that they don't want to be seen on a video camera, right? Yeah. They may prefer to not be seen. And so can you make policies that are inclusive to that are okay with that? Because everybody navigates differently, and for fun, exactly. There's a thing called Emojipedia. So you can look at all the different emojis on Emojipedia. And we know times are changing when the word of the year for 2015 by Oxford Dictionary was face with tears of joy. So it wasn't even a word, it was an emoji that won. So it's really interesting to see where things are going. But like you said, the conversation is continuing every day.
Exactly. And I think I wanted to like kind of like one last question that I wanted to ask both of you. I feel like, there's always something new to learn, something that we should always like, we should always be keeping up with news articles. So I wanted to ask you for what could be ways, that you could think of like for audiences, for anyone to just keep having this conversation, keep learning, keep yourself like informed, be always like, like be mindful, like what are ways that you could think like we could keep even like for ourselves, how can we remain informed on this issue? Like what are ways that we could like keep like listening and getting more of this type of content? Maybe we could start with you, Fiona.
Yeah. So my recommendation is this is not even like reading books or like watching documentaries, but looking at your friend group and like look at like whom you hang out with the most and what kind of relationship you have, because that's the group of people that you interact the most and hear the stories from, and see like what kind of people you would notice that like, oh, like they're all like me, versus there are people who are not as much like me, but like a lot of people would like naturally kind of gravitate towards people who are more like yourself. So I think it's important to be more intentional in like getting to know and also build like really genuine relationship or friendship with people who might not be like you, who might not look like you, who might not grow up in the cultural background like yours. But that's when you really get to see the world from a different angle, and that's when you start seeing some kind of challenges that you might have never experienced, and also you get to share your stories so that they will update their understanding of the world. So I think it really starts from your very personal life and in relationships. So yeah, just make new friends or be curious about like others' life experiences or their perspectives and be open to them, and update like your understanding of the world.
Yeah, so in other words, like try to meet people who think different from you, who are different from you, and learn from those individuals. How about you, Diana?
I think that is such an important comment that Fiona made, is going to that granular level of where you're at and connecting with those around you in that environment and understanding who they are, sharing those experiences, understanding their backgrounds, and having those dialogues. And sometimes those are healthy dialogues, but they can really lead to deep learning. And so that is very important. If folks are looking for other resources where they might see what is out there, and on campus at Berkeley, because I'm from the Division of Equity Inclusion, I would say our Division of Equity Inclusion website that Sandra Messick puts together is really excellent, and that's diversity.berkeley.edu. Another really great website is the Othering and Belonging Institute on campus, and I'll put that on the chat, belonging.berkeley.edu. And they have all sorts of interesting stories and pieces around cultural strategy, strategic narrative. They're just really a space where you can learn a lot if you just have a little bit of time. And for those of you who are readers, there's a couple books that I thought were really interesting. One was Weapons of Mass Destruction by Kathy O'Neill. That has a lot of interesting little narratives that you don't necessarily have to read front to back. But when we look at algorithm bias and when we look at how do we advocate for equity and inclusion, sometimes it's really important to see where that journey has gone and what are some of the historical contexts that we should be aware of. There's also another book for students that I always like to suggest if they're interested in technology. It's called Women in Technology, and by Tara Wheeler. I really like that because it shares STEM women profiles, but it also shares career advice, like how to do a coding interview, how to set that up. So those are kind of 4 resources that I can think of that could help, kind of expand that constant foundation that folks are building with equity and inclusion and diversity.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you both. And I will definitely have all the different links all available in the description of the podcast. But I want to also take a chance to thank you. I think that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank both of you. I think it was great to have you on the podcast. Really, I feel like, I think this is a conversation, like I said, it doesn't end here. I think it's just like a multi-dimensional conversation that I feel like we could even make like podcast number 2, number 3, and keep going with this conversation. I would love to always keep having this conversation with the two of you. But thank you for joining us for today's podcast. Really appreciate having you on the podcast. And that's all we have for today. And please stay tuned for the next podcast. And thank you for listening. And that's all we have for today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya, folks.
Appreciate being invited. Thank you.